Today, 25% of the legislators in the Indian National Parliament are people accused of serious crimes like rape, murder, extortion, kidnapping, and so on. 1/4 of the legislators are of that category. In some state governments, like in Bihar, it's 50% of the legislators. So the nexus between crime and politics has grown. And the reason I'm pessimistic is that this is a bad equilibrium. In other words, it is in no one's interest to change this. The efforts to reduce corruption, to reduce the criminality in politics have been going on for the last 30, 40 years. But no one is willing to do it. Why would I do it if I think that you will not do it? And so the bad equilibrium continues.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager, due diligence, or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we'll have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager Niels Larsen.
For me, the best part of my podcasting journey has been the opportunity to speak to a huge range of extraordinary people from all around the world. In this series, I have invited one of them, namely Kevin Coldiron, to host a series of in-depth conversations to help uncover and explain new ideas to make you a better investor. In the series, Kevin will be speaking to authors of new books and research papers to better understand the global economy and the dynamics that shape it, so that we can all successfully navigate the challenges within it. And with that, please welcome Kevin Coldiron.
Thanks, Niels, and welcome everyone. So India, it's the world's largest country. It's 4 times the size of the US. 1 out of every 5 people under the age of 25 in the world live in India. McKinsey says it's already the Indian century. Morgan Stanley is very bullish on the stock market and the economy. And I think a lot of people in the West look at the increasingly confrontational relationship between China and the US and kind of look to India as potentially the buffer, as the world's so-called largest democracy. But our guest today has a different perspective. Ashoka Mody is a visiting professor of international economic policy at Princeton. He worked for many years at both the IMF and the World Bank. And he's the author of a new book called India is Broken, which, as you can tell from the title, means he's got a much more somber view of India's current state and its future prospects. So today is a show for anyone who wants to spend a little time, go beneath the headlines, go beneath the hype, and try to understand the world's largest country a bit better. So with that rather long introduction, Ashoka Mody, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the show today.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you for having me.
So I know that you were born in India, raised in India, you did your undergraduate and I think also a graduate degree in India. Would you mind just giving us a little personal history about your time in India, and then how you came to the United States? And then perhaps we could then jump ahead and just hear about what motivated you to write this particular book now.
Okay, thank you. So my father worked for the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank. So growing up, lived in different cities: Calcutta, Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, or what used to be called Madras then. Yeah, just a public servant, my very typical child of a public servant. very heavy emphasis on education at that level of society, and went to a very well-known engineering college in Chennai called the Indian Institute of Technology. And then went to a small center in Trivandrum, which specializes in economic development. Although I graduated in electronic engineering, my heart was always in economic development. And so I transitioned the day I finished engineering. And then eventually I came to Boston University to do a PhD. And from there, then sort of life just took its own course, went to Bell Labs, World Bank, and then, as you say, IMF, and now Princeton. I'm a serial retirer. I've retired early from the World Bank, early from the IMF, and now I'm at Princeton.
That's a very good strategy, actually. So when you retired for this most recent time, is that when you started working on the book?
So I did an earlier book. So when in the IMF, I was working on Europe. And in some ways, the high point of my professional life was doing the bailout of Ireland in the midst of the global financial crisis. That was, I believe, in 2010. And then I stuck around for another couple of years. I was the man responsible for Germany at the IMF. So when I came to Princeton in 2012, I did a book on Europe, on the Euro specifically, called Euro Tragedy, which took me 6 years to write. In fact, we were just talking about Barry Eichengreen, and early on I asked Barry, I said, Barry, how long does it take to write a book? And he said, twice as long as you think it will. And indeed, it took me 3 times as long. So it took 6 years to write that book. And then the last 4 years, I've been working on the India book.
And what motivated you, given that your professional career, at least the part of it toward the end was focused on Europe. What motivated you to kind of pivot and write about your home country?
So, as I say in the preface to the book, in I think 2018, I became a U.S. citizen. Finally, after being in the United States for almost 35 years. And when I did so, there was an sense of emotional wrench. So I called my father. And I said, I'm not feeling sort of very good about the fact that I have had to give up my Indian citizenship because India does not allow dual citizenship. And he promptly reassured me, you will always be an Indian at heart. And that Indian at heart has been speaking for a long time to me. As you said, Kevin, in your introductory remarks, there's been a narrative about India which has been prevalent, at least I would say, since the early 90s, that India is this country which is on the go. It is a competitor of China. People often used India, China in the same breath for a long time. Then China raced ahead. And then there was this notion that India will become a counterweight to China. And having seen the lived reality, although I belong to the part of India which, lives pretty much first world lives, even in India, you see the lived reality. And the narrative that the Indian authorities and the Western elite tell about India didn't just pass the smell test for me. And I had this urge to say, why don't I tell the story as I have seen it? And I felt in so doing that telling a contemporary story was not enough because the history was important. History was important in the sense that once we started down a certain path, the choices increasingly became limited. And that's why a history.
Yeah, and that definitely that exact point really comes through clearly in the book as you talk about the initial choices of economic development model after independence and then what followed on from that. You really do get this sense of kind of path dependence and development. Um, you say actually say toward the end of the book that when India became independent in 1947, it had faced three challenges to basically increase agricultural productivity, make farmers more productive, create good jobs in the cities for a growing population, and to compete internationally. And to meet those challenges, it relies on what you called an improbable democracy, essentially relying on the wisdom of poor and largely illiterate citizens. And then you kind of conclude by saying, hey, 75 years later, those three challenges are still unmet. And not only that, the democracy is maybe no longer a democracy. Some people have said it's basically India is now an elected autocracy, and press freedom has been eroded. There's increasing violence. So that's quite a different story than what we often hear in the Western press. So I wondered if perhaps we could start by talking about the path that India did not take, because that to me sort of serves as sort of like a reference point in your book. You're referring back to it a lot, and so there's basically a development model that was followed by Japan and then Korea, Taiwan, even China and Vietnam, all in slightly different ways. But could you lay out for us that kind of development path that led those other East Asian countries to, kind of to meet their development challenges? And then we can talk about the path that India did choose to take.
Very good. So all of these countries started with the vast bulk of the workforce in agriculture. Japan, by one estimate, at the time of the Meiji Revolution, had about 80% of its workforce in agriculture. India, at the time of independence, had about 70% of the workforce in agriculture. And it's a standard statement in development economics that development is essentially transferring people out of what is a low productivity agriculture into higher productivity urban jobs. That's the essence of development. And Japan did it relatively quickly in the sense that by the 1920s, pretty much everybody who wanted an urban job could get one. And then Korea and Taiwan and China did it much faster than Japan did. So Japan took almost about 50 years to do it. Korea and Taiwan did, and China took even less time to do it. And that requires this dual effort. Raise productivity in agriculture so that you need fewer people to work in agriculture, and create jobs to which people can then come, those who have been freed from agricultural chores. And in the Indian context, we never really got around to doing that. Especially in the first 17 years under Jawaharlal Nehru, the share of agriculture remained essentially the same for 17 years. And then it inevitably did decline because the distress in agriculture keeps increasing. Remember, Indian farms tend to get subdivided by generation. Farms become smaller. And so the ability to make a living in agriculture declines. And then in addition, if you don't have urban jobs, you have this tension that you want to get out, but you're not quite sure where to go. And so there is the migrant, but the migration was limited for a very long time.
And in the kind of the East Asian model, it seems like the way to create those urban jobs to absorb the people who are leaving agriculture is through manufacturing, and through starting off with kind of, I guess, low value added and then working your way up the chain. And in order to do that, Again, I'm really just kind of repeating, but what's in the book, you're saying, hey, you really need to focus on universal primary education, because that workforce, an educated workforce, is a more productive workforce. You need to have women educated and to have them into the workforce. And you need to be willing to allow your exchange rate to weaken to make your products more competitive. So those were choices that, you said India never made.
Correct. So India did not make those choices for the first 35 years after independence. For some reasons that I have still not understood, except in sort of a very broad cultural sense, there is a sense of humiliation if the currency is devalued. But as you rightly point out, and as I repeat many times in my book, every East Asian country used aggressive devaluation to create demand for their goods. So the pattern was identical. A relatively cheap currency, highly educated workforce, highly in the sense that primary and secondary, highly educated for the labor-intensive products that they were producing, and women in the workforce. Just to step back on these 2 points, Udit Galore has a new book called The Journey of Humanity. And he says,
we had him on the show actually in the fall to talk about his book.
He says right off the bat in his opening few pages that every country that has industrialized has educated its kids and has brought women into the workforce. No country has achieved gender parity, but has made an effort to achieve gender parity. And the East Asians did that in their own way. They put a huge emphasis on primary and then secondary and eventually tertiary education. And they brought women into the workforce. Again, gender disparity remained, but it became less over time, or at least it overcame some of the traditional barriers. So that's on the supply side, if you will. And on the demand side, you want to create demand through a currency that is relatively cheap. And all of these countries initially produced relatively shoddy goods. I remember the first time I went to Korea, in one of the bazaars there, I saw a New Balance shoe, which at that time in 1984, it was a very desirable thing to have. I bought it for $5 or $10. So when I came back to America, everyone was very, very excited. You got New Balance shoes? And so they produce relatively shoddy quality stuff. But what the lesson I learned through writing this book is that the world has some appetite for cheap, low quality products for a while. And all these countries then learn. That's the key part, that as they become part of the global markets, their buyers demand higher quality. And that demand for higher quality forces them to upgrade. Again, on the same visit to Korea, they were producing resistors. Today, most people don't even know what a resistor is because it comes embedded in computer chips. The televisions being assembled on Samsung's floors had Hitachi and Toshiba boxes around them. Today, no one knows about Hitachi and Toshiba, and Samsung is a world leader. So there is this tremendous infusion of knowledge that occurs slowly at the start, and then it picks up. And that's the process of development that all these East Asian countries went through.
And so India really, for the most part, did not go down that path. And the path they did take was one that you called kind of building temples. So instead of focusing on, mass education and mass producing in manufacturing, Prime Minister Nehru, who led the country after independence, he focused instead on heavy industry, big projects, developing a few elite universities. And, what's the outcome of that model? Because that's kind of, as we talked about at the beginning, that India's history is path dependent, and that was kind of the first few steps on the path. What are the economics problem with kind of building temples for India?
So there were three problems. Problem one was that the skill base, such as India developed, was tuned much more to heavy industry. And some very heartwarming stuff, the aerospace industry, the locomotive industry, and fertilizers, but these were not job creating. And so essentially over the Nehruvian period, the number of people seeking jobs kept increasing. So first is the skill base. Now associated with that, the emphasis right from the start was on tertiary education. So as you pointed out, or maybe I said so, I'm the beneficiary of the Nehruvian policies. I went to an IIT, which is considered very elite. But the phrase I think I use in the book is how many Indian geniuses were left undiscovered. The vast majority of people did not go to primary school for a very long time. Only in recent years, the primary school education, there is 100% enrollment at the primary level sometime in the 90s. But the neglect of the primary schools, and again, this is the history, the neglect of primary schools has also left a legacy of poor teaching quality, corruption in the school system. The result is that kids who are in fifth grade struggle to do second grade level tasks. And then as they go to eighth grade, that becomes even harder. The gap in between their requirements and their standards and their abilities widens. Something like 30% of the kids drop out by the time they reach high school. And those who do go through then go to a slew of tertiary education colleges, which are run by politicians and notables almost as a racket. So this is the odd thing. There is a small group of Indians who get excellent education, and you see a lot of them in the United States, in Silicon Valley. You see all these CEOs, and you also see commentators on television. Especially during the COVID period, I don't know if you noticed, a lot of the doctors who were commenting on US television were of Indian origin. So you have this narrow elite of educated people with a vast number behind that, which is not visible to the Western eye typically, and which, frankly, the Indian elite also ignores. So the legacies are manifold.
Yeah. So you have this concept of two Indias in the book, and just listening to you talk right there, that really kind of crystallized in my mind. Is that you've got this layer. I don't know if it's 10%, 15% of the population that's well educated, as you said, lives first world lives, and it seems like I said at the beginning, this kind of hype about India is really a hype about that first India, that 10 to 15%. And when you think about the size of India, right, it's 1.4 billion people. If it's 10%, that's 140 million. So it's kind of like an economy in its own right. It's the economy that we see in the West. But what you were saying is that the second India, I don't know if it's 80, 85%, that's an India where education, healthcare, women participation has really fallen well below the standards set by other East Asian countries. And the issue, I think you're saying, is that, hey, when we look at India's economic success, people tend to look at GDP, and they look at GDP per capita, and that 10 to 15% is generating high GDP growth. But what really matters is jobs. And as time has progressed, there's an increasing what you call jobs deficit for the second India. And that, I believe you say, is now on the order of 100 million or perhaps more jobs that don't exist. So you have a lot of Indians who, some are unemployed, but most are underemployed. And what, I guess, social issues does that underemployment create for not just for the second India, but for the the whole of the country?
So let me address the second part of your question first. The first world Indians have largely insulated themselves from the second India in the following sense. They send their kids to elite schools. Increasingly, they send their kids to colleges abroad because the elite colleges have very few openings, very few seats, as they call them in India. So a lot of Indian kids who can afford it go abroad to study. They have their own water systems. They have extremely high quality healthcare systems. A judiciary that does not function for most people, where the pending cases keep going up because the courts are clogged. If you are well connected, you can navigate the judicial system. I was recently in India, and someone was driving me, and I noticed a console on the dashboard of the car. I'd never seen that before, and I said, "What is that?" And he says, "We have an air purifier in the car." And the console was giving you the air quality index inside the car. So the air is highly polluted. Indian cities compete with each other to be in the top 10 of the most polluted cities in the world. So the elite have insulated themselves. So for them, the main point of connection is cheap labor. To have housekeepers and maids in the house and chauffeurs. That's the connection. Now, I'm sure I'm not being completely fair, because a lot of very rich Indians do philanthropic activities, and very, very important philanthropic activities. It doesn't add up to a broad process of upliftment and growth. So that's the first world India. The rest of the India, this is the question I struggled with a lot. Why, if my analysis is correct, do we not see a much greater sense of anger, which then spills out into the streets and protests? And there are three answers to that. The number one answer, and this is the most unfortunate of the three answers, that every time, and again, this is very path dependent. 1967, there was a peasant rebellion in Naxalbari in West Bengal. And Mrs. Gandhi put it down with a very strong use of the coercive power of the state, police, and then army. And then very soon after she began that process, she created something called an Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which allows the police to detain you by giving you some sort of general cause with no obligation to bring you on trial in a timely way. And so you languish in jail for long periods of time without even a clear charge being framed against you. So the one practice that began with Mrs. Gandhi, every subsequent government has felt it a useful tool in their governance toolkit, so to speak. And this latest government, since 2014, has used it on steroids. So one is that if there are protests, they are put down with a very heavy hand. The second is there's a lot of attraction for low-grade criminal activity. Some of it goes into organized crime, And the third, most recently, since about the mid-80s, is that young, frustrated youth had become foot soldiers of what in India they call Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. So those energies, which might have otherwise gone into social protest, had either been put down or been channeled into these other into these other areas, which do not add up to a productive use of their time and labor.
You referred to this, and I get the pronunciation right, Hindutva philosophy, which is one that's been, I guess, adopted, or maybe not even adopted, but has been very much a part of the current Prime Minister Modi's life right from a very young age. Could you expand a little bit on what that means, the Hindutva ideology, philosophy? I'm not quite sure how to phrase it.
So the father of the Hindutva philosophy is a guy named Veer Savarkar. And it goes back to the early 20th century. He wrote a little booklet in a cellular jail in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where he was in prison for anarchist activities put by the British. And he wrote this piece. It was a very brutal cell. He eventually pleaded for mercy and he came out. And that book instantly became the blueprint for a Hindu nationalism. Basically, it said that if your blood was part of a lineage that came historically from that land, and if you were devoted to that land, you were a Hindu. So Savarkar was quite clear that he was not talking of Hindu in terms of religion. He had some notion of geography and obedience and for the land, and it was a commitment to the areas and to a certain cultural process. The RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, soon after Savarkar articulated this, then picks this up and creates a organized system of grassroots movement, semi-militaristic at times in terms of their drills and so on. And that whole setup, Savarkar and RSS then has its own heads who become very important figures in the Hindutva. They lie fallow for a long time, till about the mid-80s, when Mrs. Gandhi's tenure is coming to an end, the social tensions are on the increase, and they create a demand for breaking a mosque on which a Mughal emperor is supposed to have built, a mosque that a Mughal emperor is supposed to have built on a site where there is some notion that the Lord Ram, who is a very beloved deity in the Hindu system, was born. And that becomes a focal point for a political movement. And from there on, there was no let-up. It just kept growing. And it then just, in 2014, Prime Minister Modi became head of a party that represents that set of beliefs.
The way you describe it in the book is that Modi's political career has really taken off when he kind of fused the, I guess, underlying energy of the Hindutva movement with kind of business-friendly policies. And he developed, when he was governor of the state of Guljurat, if I've pronounced that correctly, or close to it.
Yes, that's Gujarat is very
he
good.
developed
Yes.
this Guljurat model of development, and then he brought that philosophy to the national government when he took over in 2014. So could you explain what that kind of model of development is, and why it was so, I guess, seems so seductive to not only India but the rest of the world looking into India?
The Gujarat model of development is a phrase that emerges sometime in the early 2000s, if I remember right. And it was essentially a system of generous subsidization of large business, relatively cheap land, sometimes low interest loans, no questions asked, environmental clearances. So it was very generous for big business. And so, not surprisingly, big business touted its virtues. But again, by this point, there are two things to notice. One is a theme that we've spoken about before, which is that this particular model was not particularly job creating because it tended to go into heavy industry. So, for example, Gujarat during the period that Narendra Modi was chief minister had high GDP growth rates. But if you put up a petrochemical plant or even an auto plant, in fact, I'm not sure there were many auto plants, but there was a lot of petrochemical development there. You create very few jobs. You get a lot of GDP, but you create very few jobs. So it was not job creating. And by now, we have another important force in the Indian political, economic, and social system, which is environmental degradation. So this is another reason I am very skeptical of GDP as a metric, because if you're chewing up the inheritance of your kids, you can show GDP today, but what are you leaving for them tomorrow? The environmental degradation again begins early, accelerates during Mrs. Gandhi's period, and by the new millennium, environmental degradation is again going at very rapid speed. So the Gujarat model embodies, in a sense, it takes the old capital-intensive, limited job-producing model and ties it into this further depredation of the environment. That's the Gujarat model. It's attractive because corporate profits are large. And so you have Ratan Tata, for example, one of the most important Indian tycoons, coming on Fareed Zakaria's show, the GPS, Global Public Square, in which he says, yeah, that's great stuff. I wish I'd done more. Yeah, sure, it's great for him. There's no problem with that.
So it's kind of a modern version of the temple's development strategy in your mind, which is, kind of reinforces this to India path. The Gujarat development model creates some jobs. They tend to be highly skilled, relatively well paid, attractive to foreigners, but leaves this continuing job deficit for the second India.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, in 2013, 2014, while the campaign was going on for the 2014 election, the BJP, in its manifesto, the Prime Minister himself talked about jobs. And the elite commentators writing for elite Indian newspapers and international business and the international business press was claiming somehow that the Gujarat model would solve India's problems. But the Gujarat model was singularly unsuited to solve India's problems for the very three reasons, Kevin, that you began with. It did very little for agriculture. It did very little for urban jobs. And sure, it did not create a more competitive Indian manufacturing sector in the global economy. The share of global exports of manufactured goods has stagnated at, I think, about 1.8% or thereabouts since about 2012. This is a period during which Vietnam has come from below and caught up with India.
I was thinking, there are multiple questions, but I was going back to this issue of, what happens, what's the fallout from this, kind of ever increasing jobs deficit? And one of the things that surprised me in reading your book was the question marks you raised about economic statistics and their integrity, because I'd always kind of thought of India as being like having this very sort of professional civil service producing good quality data. And you're saying actually it's that, very hard to get hold of kind of reliable employment statistics. Some surveys on poverty were, dismissed because they showed results that were unfavorable. So you've got this kind of growing question mark, in your opinion, over data, and at the same time, you've got an erosion of press freedoms that the government. If there's critical articles in the press, then the journalists are investigated for tax issues, corruption, etc. So I'm wondering if these, the erosion of data quality, the erosion of press freedoms are kind of like a necessary fallout from a government that's not producing enough jobs to for its constituents. So it's sort of saying, hey, we need to kind of cover that up to some extent. We need to suppress any criticism of that. And again, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just kind of repeating back to you what's in the book. But is that kind of how you view it? Is that those things kind of almost expected given the situation?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. So, just to give you 4 data points, the GDP statistics are under a cloud, but put that to the side. That's the least of the problems. The employment statistics are under a cloud.
And when you say under a cloud, can you be more specific? What do you mean by that?
So, for example, there's been something called the National Sample Survey, which has every 4 or 5 years done a sample survey from which careful labor economists have then tracked the trends. And those trends show a very bleak picture. So just as I was completing my book, I asked myself, what does the Ministry of Finance say? Ministry of Finance used to publish a certain set of numbers and they discontinued them. And they started publishing a new series that showed enormous job growth. And so I asked a very well-known labor economist, what's going on? On the one hand, we're seeing all this frantic search for jobs where millions of people apply for hundreds of jobs. And the government says that they're creating, that the economy is creating millions of jobs. And he said, just ignore it. That's complete nonsense. And indeed, it turned out to be complete nonsense. Those numbers have some erratic nature to them. No one quite understands what they are doing. And when you even them out over a period of time, it in fact turns out that even those numbers, properly presented, do not show any job growth. But they throw a lot of dust in the eye. Same thing with the poverty numbers. So India was one of the pioneers in doing sample surveys to estimate the extent of poverty. The last survey done on poverty was in 2011-12. In 2018, 17-18, I believe, there was another survey which showed that poverty had gone up. And so the government promptly said, this is garbage, and discarded that survey. There's been no further survey since then. The census, which was supposed to occur in 2021, has been postponed, first because of COVID, and now there is no date on which the census is going to occur. So, on every important statistic of a macro nature, there is an informational fog. An informational fog in which you can create numbers and say, well, this is till the real numbers come out, this is what we presume it is. And so therefore, you can tell any story you want to tell. And that is why a lot of the sort of, cheerleaders for the Indian economy will tell you a story and you have no basis. You have to go back to the fundamentals and say, yeah, but come on, does this pass the smell test? And it often doesn't. I mean, just I'll give you one last example. There's been a global mantra that India is the fastest growing economy in the world. And that is part of the cheerleading process that's going on. Now, here's what's happening. If you take between 2019 and 2012, the Indian economy fell sharply during COVID, bounced back, fell again a second wave of COVID, bounced back. So it's yo-yoed. If you take the average, it's about 3.5% per year over this 3-year period, about the same as it was before COVID, before in the pre-COVID year. So the Indian economy, by any reasonable metric, has been growing at about 3.5% since about mid-2019. Now, what has happened is that a number of people have taken the periods of the bounce back, which the bounce back will be large because you've fallen so sharply. And they've extrapolated from the bounce back to say India is the fastest growing economy in the world. That is wishful thinking, clothed in bad economics at best. And so because the data fog can be easily manipulated, there is an incentive to maintain the data fog.
That's kind of surprising and disappointing. If you're a Westerner like me, you know, and you talk about this in the book that the Western press kind of has repeatedly got India wrong, but going all the way back to the time of Mrs. Gandhi. And, just it's easy to, find stories just, recently in the FT and Bloomberg that are quite positive about India. Where does someone who, like me or like our listeners who's interested in India go for what you consider to be kind of an accurate picture, or at least a picture that presents the other side to the Indian growth story? Where do you go for data and analysis?
Where do I go? Very good question. The Princeton Alumni Weekly recently asked me to tell their readers which are the 3 books on India which I like. And all 3 books are written by journalists who are on-the-ground reporters. So one book is by a Mumbai-based journalist called Landscapes of Loss. She talks about the distress in agriculture, about the interaction of a system which through years of environmental degradation has lost water and is now facing the onset of a climate crisis or periodic heat waves, and therefore acute distress during several parts of the year. Another book is on floods in Chennai in 2015. I'm forgetting the title, but the author is Krupa Ghee. She has written a beautiful book about the floods. Now, what is important about the floods, and this is again an extremely important theme, that the floods were due to excessive or improper release of water from a dam. But the real problem was that this construction industry has built over the water bodies in cities. And this is true in every city in India. What that means is that even if there is a mild downpour, the water just comes flooding into the city because the absorptive capacity of the traditional sinks of water has been shut off. This is part of the process of a rampant and completely chaotic urban development. And she has described how this construction devastated the city of Chennai. But recently we had these floods in Bangalore. Same thing. Same thing happens in Delhi. Same thing happens in Mumbai. And a third book, which is much more visceral, is about this sort of acute corruption in state governments. It's called Despite the State by a fellow named Rajshekhar, who also has written brilliantly about something called sand mining. The illegal sand mining is probably the source of the largest organized crime in India today. Sand is an extremely important ingredient in concrete, which is an important ingredient in construction, highly valued product, very organized mafia, many of whom become rich and filter into politics at local level and at senior level. I don't know if you noticed, one of the themes of my book is the increased encroachment of politics by criminals. Today, 25% of the legislators in the Indian national parliament are people accused of serious crimes like rape, murder, extortion, kidnapping, and so on. 1/4 of the legislators are of that category. In some state governments, like in Bihar, it's 50% of the legislators. So the nexus between crime and politics has grown. And the reason I'm pessimistic is that this is a bad equilibrium. In other words, it is in no one's interest to change this. The efforts to reduce corruption, to reduce the criminality in politics have been going on for the last 30, 40 years. But no one is willing to do it. Why would I do it if I think that you will not do it? And so the bad equilibrium continues.
Yeah, it's almost like the power in some sense is in those 100 or 200 million of underemployed people. They're the ones, I suppose, who, had they were mobilized in the right way, could create the pressure to change that. But they, according to your book anyway, are mobilized, and their energies are devoted to to this kind of nationalist philosophy. And instead, I want to ask you about press freedom. So, there were some shocking statistics in the book about press freedom, and that that's been eroded a lot. And again, that's not, I guess, as a kind of a naive Westerner looking in, you sort of think of India as a land of many, many voices and people very, opinionated and willing to speak out. But it sounds like over time that's less and less the case. People who are, the author of those 3 books that you just talked about, what happens to them? Are they perfectly free to publish what they want? Are there consequences for them? Are there going to be consequences for someone like yourself?
Right. So authors of the books so far have been generally ignored because they cater to a very small audience. On the newspapers, there has been a bifurcation. The general conventional mainstream media has taken the route of telling the narrative that the authorities and the international elite want to hear. With some exceptions every now and then, but by and large, do not deviate too much from that general pattern. There is something called the Digipub, that is digital publications, which are more open, more forthright, but clearly independent press is subject continuously to the possibility of being questioned. And all you need to do is question them for tax evasion or not following certain rules and laws. And most recently, just in the last few days, one of the most prominent think tanks has been deprived of a license to access foreign funding sources, which will, in effect, at least highly compromise, if not cripple that institution over the next several months. So voices of dissent are not welcome, and people are adapting to that by changing their behavior so that you don't get on the wrong side of the authorities, because the consequences are not trivial.
So, we take that perspective and we look at kind of what I was talking about right at the beginning, which is this global, I guess, increasingly global confrontation between China and the US, and this kind of deglobalization and the I think the hope amongst a lot of Westerners that, India might, if not side with the West, at least present kind of a buffer zone against an increasingly kind of autocratic governments. It sounds like you would disagree with that you think actually maybe India's incentives or their direction is, if not to be more aligned with China, certainly not to kind of automatically side with the West either.
Look, Kevin, on this matter, my expertise runs out. What I can say is that if the premise of that statement is that India is a strong economy and democracy, then that premise is not at this moment in time a valid one. It's neither a strong economy nor a strong democracy. In fact, I say so in the book, and you may know of this institution in Sweden called VDEM, Varieties of Democracy. They've just come out with their late 2023 report, but already the report that I cited in my book, they categorize India as an electoral autocracy. And I think that sounds very reasonable in terms of the nature of the state's use of coercive power, in terms of the freedom of press, in terms of a broad lack of tolerance of dissent. And so if the Western world is expecting, is basing its thinking on a strong economy and strong democracy, I think that is a mistake.
You spend a little bit of time at the end of the book on things that might change, that might improve, those two things, and generally improve the lives of the people in the second India. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you think might help? You talk a lot about kind of pushing power down to kind of a local level and creating, I guess, alternative models of kind of, decision making and governance.
So, I used the phrase bad equilibrium just now. And as a scholar yourself, you appreciate that. The key point is that if a number of people cheat, then it's in everyone's incentive to cheat. If the political system is corrupt, then the rest of the system is impossible for it to be not corrupt. If there are criminals in politics being incorporated by major parties, then everybody will do it. And that basically destroys the social norms and public accountability. And you fall into a catch-22 because unaccountable politicians will not impose accountability on themselves. Therefore, I have steered away from giving specific policy measures because specific policy measures can always be distorted if the system is unaccountable. What I'm saying at the end is that we have to find a way where the governed and those who govern them enter into a relationship of trust. And my understanding of both the history of successful democracies, including in the United States, as Alexis Tocqueville so eloquently wrote, and then Robert Putnam wrote, is that local democracy is where some of that trust and cooperation is the foundation for which is laid over there. And my plea, my hope, my cry is that we begin there so that that process of rebuilding norms, rebuilding trust occurs, and hopefully then it begins to filter up and filter across the country. And that is then will be the basis for a renewed commitment to health, to education, to a judiciary that is fair, to an environmental policy that is considerate of the next generation, to cities that function. Because without those, the prospects, economic and political prospects for India remain very bleak.
Yeah, it's at several points during the book you were describing, the current system and I guess your view of the corruption at the government level, the link with organized crime. And I thought to myself, that could be describing New York City in the 1920s, or it could be describing Chicago in the late 1800s. And obviously, America's path and India's path very different, but there is precedent for a corrupt political system to reform itself over time if the incentives are there.
Correct. And so, in fact, just yesterday we discussed this very theme in class. The US had a number of advantages. There was competition between cities that prevented corruption from getting out of hand. There were bond markets disciplining the fiscal behavior of cities. And there was just a much greater technological momentum going on in the US. India does not have that momentum, despite the hype, and India is in a deeper bad equilibrium, and so the task is a hard one. But yes, that is exactly where, I mean, if you read Robert Putnam's books, he sees it again, that renewal that you describe in the United States, again beginning with a renewed emphasis on local communities. And I think that history is generally persuasive that it's a local community democracy that helps build trust and cooperation, and you then build from up there.
Well, I hope that is a path that eventually takes hold in India, and I want to thank you for joining the show and for writing the book, and for giving us an alternate view on a country that is clearly very important to all of us. So thanks for your work. Thanks for joining the show, and best of luck.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful reading of the book and the questions you have asked.
So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Niels.
Thank you so much, Ashok and Kevin, for a fascinating but also slightly worrying view on India, which clearly is not how the mainstream media is referring to the country. Firstly, I will say that I was very impressed with Ashok's background and some of the European crises that he had been involved in and in charge of solving following the great financial crisis. But if we start at the end of the conversation, his last statement that India is not a strong economy nor a strong democracy really should lead to more people asking themselves if we're looking at the world's most populated country through the wrong lens. I think the challenges that India faced after its independence and how they're still not resolved even 75 years after or so is very thought-provoking. And of course, the role of education and the obstacles they seem to be facing with a large percentage of students who drop out of a school before they even get to high school, leading them to fall behind even further compared to the Asian countries. And also what the underemployment that he sees can lead to in terms of societal challenges are quite worrisome. So this will be worth paying attention to without a doubt. That's it for today. Make sure you go and follow Ashok's and Kevin's work, as well as getting a copy of their books, because as you can tell from today's conversation, some of these ideas and topics are not being discussed enough on mainstream media. From Kevin and me, thanks ever so much for listening. We look forward to being back with you on the next episode. And in the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.